challenge. This is Russia. This is the Soviet Union. This is Putin Obama. Does he have the cojones of Bush, you know? Whatever. It isn't. It's a very big thing, but it's a very big thing in a new post-Cold War international order frame. And the Cold War was a bipolar competition, an ideological competition, and as people in my class know, from Truman through Nixon, was locked into a two-power frame, into two-power seesaw. If one won, the other lost. So that even if the strategic stakes might be trivial, the United States had to respond. And then Nixon discovered that there could be three players in the game and you could respond somewhere and regain some freedom of action there. Okay. The geopolitical stakes are not trivial. They're in Eurasia. They're in the heart of traditional US interests. But it would be a mistake to assume that this is part of a Cold War chessboard. There are three countries, I see three countries in the world today. Well, let's start with Russia and China are countries that have territorial appetites. Not territorial appetites, I want to rule the world, I want all the territory I can digest, but very specific territorial appetites, okay? That for Russia, essentially during communism, after communism, the borders that are looked to are the 1914 borders of Tsarist Russia, or the borders of Russia until the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, when much of the area now in question, Western Ukraine, was ceded to Germany by a Russia that didn't want to fight anymore, that wanted peace at any price. So either the 1914 borders or the borders of the Stalin-Hitler Pact. Even during the Cold War, Russian ambitions did not go far beyond those borders. If they went beyond those borders, they were about securing those borders. All right? Now, unfortunately, still a piece of modern Poland, all of Ukraine, all of Belarus, and all of the Baltic states, as well as Georgia and the states of the Caucasus, are within those borders. So that the larger implications of what Russia does, or quote-unquote gets away with in Ukraine, have every reason to directly frighten those countries. And four of those countries, Poland and the Baltics, are in NATO, in which the US has a security pact regarding any assault on them as an assault on its own territory. So the stakes are pretty serious, okay? But it's not the same game as the Cold War. For one, everybody has stipulated, fortunately for all our sakes, that the solutions have to be soft power solutions. Well, Putin hasn't stipulated, he's moving his army, obviously. But the response of the West is going to be a soft power response, right? For soft power to work, it works through the domestic politics of the targeted country. If you're not going to use military force to compel a political settlement, you're going to put on economic, cultural propaganda, other kind of pressures to get the people of that country to say, hey, you know, you're hurting our business deals in the West. Get these sanctions off. You're hurting our banking. You're hurting this. You're hurting that. I should complete the map because there's another country besides Russia that thinks in the same terms, and that's China. And China is caught in a very tricky situation here because China is a strong defender at the UN of the principles of inviolable national sovereignty and not violating borders. It's much of its dissent from what the US wanted to do twice in Iraq from Libya is based on that principle, okay? At the same time, China also has this idea of larger borders. In China's case, it was the largest extent of Chinese suzerainty, control, influence, whatever. In both cases, in Putin's sense and in the case of the Chinese leadership, it's not so much that they want this territory. Who wants to rule people who are fighting you, who are blowing up bombs? You know, there's none of that. Or they want it economically. They want it because of the domestic prestige they get of reclaiming the maximum extent historic borders. Right? There might be other formulas for political success in Russia, but the one that Putin plays in is the Yeltsin years, the Gorbachev years, the Yeltsin years were years of retreat and humiliation. I said stop. I drew the line in Chechnya. I showed we count in Georgia. Now I'm showing in Ukraine, right? And it's to show that Russia is back to the full extent of its maximum borders, and nobody can push it around. China has a similar mentality when it comes to Taiwan, when it comes to offshore islands, when it comes to Tibet, which is already under Chinese rule, or Xinjiang. The issue is you can argue till you're blue in the face that these are not Han-Chinese, they'd be happier somewhere else, it's only trouble. In China, the concept is this regime shows it has the mandate of heaven because it has restored China to its full glory. Essentially the same for Putin, all right? That his regime, remember the fluidity of the Russian situation after how many decades of Bolshevik ideology, a successor regime has to establish its ideological basis legitimately and say, this is the successor regime, those were transition regimes. We're consolidating, I'm Napoleon, I brought us back, and I'm proving that by pushing out in those old borders. And we've all read millions of times about how contested those borders are, how those borders were moved, how Khrushchev in 1954 made a gift of the Crimea to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic when it didn't matter much which Soviet Socialist Republic's flag waved over it, how Russia's Black Sea fleet depends on the base in Crimea. It needs that access to the sea. It would have loved to have had the Straits. That's what the Truman Doctrine was all about. It didn't get the Straits. It wants the Black Sea fleet for understandable reasons. It negotiated a deal with Ukraine that it had access to that. You could construct some scenario, some retreat scenario, some exit ramp scenario, which if it said, given the changed circumstances of Ukraine and the toppling of the regime there, Russia needs security guarantees that it will always have military access to that fleet. And in the name of that, with minimal other incursions on Ukrainian sovereignty, get a solution. But you won't get a solution, you don't get a soft power solution until it's in the interest of all the players. And what we're seeing now is sort of a dialogue of the deaf, or maybe a dialogue of the shouting would be a better way to put it, which is to say that for Putin, every time John Kerry or Obama says, this is a red line, this will not stand, there will be consequences, Putin wins at home. He loves them to say that. And then there aren't consequences. And he takes his shirt off and gets on the horse and says, see, gets in the Cossacks with whips if he needs to. Different when Mrs. Merkel or Mr. Steinmeier says that. Right? It's a different relationship, which is kind of funny, considering that the historic relationship with Germany and Russia is not a cozy and a happy one, right? And not only that, but that both countries have used the specter of the other to rouse up domestic opinion in nationalist and belligerent ways. But now it's kind of different, which is to say, and there's a curious, I've talked about this with Professor Kuna. He sees, and I'm sure he's right, an interesting collaboration going on between the German government and the Polish government. Germany has a coalition government now, a relatively new coalition government as a result of the last elections. In the last coalition government, Mrs. Merkel had a foreign minister who she couldn't stand and thought was crazy and never listened to. Now, that was from the Free Democrats, the liberals. Now she has a foreign minister from the Social Democrats, supposedly the other party, who she's very comfortable with. They get on very well. Not even of the ego splits you had with Schroeder and Fischer when the socialists were in power. So you have a very harmonious, bipartisan German operation speaking for German interests. And Poland, perhaps the country with the most on the line here, is content to have Germany in the lead, though they like it when the Pentagon stiffens their spine by they move some fighter squadrons from Italy to Poland today and show that, we're NATO's the Three Musketeers and all the rest of it. But the thing is that to refine what I said earlier, when Obama or Kerry says there will be consequences, and those consequences are beyond what Berlin and Warsaw and the EU are prepared to insist on, then Obama only succeeds in flaunting his own weakness, as he managed to do with the right policies on Syria. Some of you would make for a talk on that in the fall semester. He made all the right decisions, but by all the talk of red lines that he didn't live up to, he essentially made the U.S. a lesser player, a weaker player in it. So the trick here is for U.S. diplomacy to not to look to U.S. public opinion like we're lined up with Merkel and the EU and Poland. Not to look like U.S. public opinion, oh, it's those Europeans again, the ones from Venus, you know, the ones who don't want to fight and are afraid to put their energy at risk kind of stuff. That the U.S. does much better for itself in terms of its role in Eurasian geopolitics and its credibility for future situations that might develop with China over offshore islands in the Pacific, if it does not have to play by Professor Harper's iron rule here, if it doesn't have to show, if Obama doesn't feel the need to show to American domestic opinion that he is a strutting Marshall Cold War president prepared to do whatever. He does much better for real American interests to line up his ducks, line up his allies, and move on that kind of front. So that his job really, or the job of Obama and Kerry, is one of selling at home a policy that moves forward with multilateral soft power and keeps the Germans in the lead. That's a mouthful, I know. Why don't I stop for questions, and if there aren't enough, I'll resume.
Yes, I might rant a bit, but one of the things that we got from Vanessa's initiative Day in Life was that when Ukraine denuclearized, part of the deal was that both US and Russia respect sovereignty, and which is not happening. Like Russia is doing what it wants to do, and the US and the West is not stepping up to the game and actually defending the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of the Ukraine. That's one thing. The precedent, my question is, what precedent does it set for a country like Japan? Which, you mentioned Poland and other stuff as well. I've forgotten the other country. But for a country like Japan, which almost surrendered its national security to the US post World War II, and with the rise in China, it completely, with this situation, completely raises new questions for them. Like, why would I surrender my national security to a country which is not defending another country which they promised that they would? So what kind of precedent does it set for a country like Japan?
I spent many years wrestling with these issues.
Yeah.
These are good questions. We wrestled them a little before my time, when the Hungarians listened to Radio Free Europe and rose up, and the West didn't come. Again in Czechoslovakia in '68. Again in Poland in 1980. By that point, I think the East Europeans knew what to expect and what not to expect. But not only have I had to wrestle with them to figure out what the New York Times was going to say about them, I don't, whatever you may think, I don't lock myself in an isolation booth and come out with a policy. I talk to the policymakers too. And over the years, policymakers of both parties, the smarter policymakers of both parties, have understood, don't get trapped by abstractions. The U.S. has something called the Taiwan Defense Act. It's never going to be invoked. I'll tell you that now. Russia de facto occupies two parts of Georgia, breaking the Westphalian rules, breaking the settlement. The Ukrainian thing is particularly dicey because it's tied to a non-proliferation issue. So rather than ask about Japan, one might ask about Iran. Iran looks and say, well, if we give up our nukes in exchange for the guarantee that no one will attack us, I guess that's not worth it much any more than Gorbachev agreeing to German unification for the guarantee that NATO would not expand eastward, which was also broken. The truth is that there is no international law. There's barely domestic law in this country, as you see, when it comes to the NSA and the CIA. But there's no international law. There's aspirations to international order, all right? There are rules that countries propound, Security Council resolutions that people pass, conventions that people sign on to, even treaties that people sign on to. that are good, that are worth advocating, that people abide by, that are worth advocating. Wait a minute, you're walking away from a treaty you signed. You diluted your word. But if we don't want the guns of, or the shouts of March 2014 to be like the guns of August 2014, we have to be not in mechanical lockstep about these things, all right? That the art of politics and statesmanship, particularly diplomacy, is blurring things, not clarifying things. There are very few diplomatic deals I can think of, including the successful ones made anywhere, that weren't based on what diplomats call constructive ambiguity. You know, the Shanghai communique on U.S.-China relations, if you go back and look at that, there's the Chinese statement, there's the U.S. statement. They say opposite things, they sit side by side in one communique. And everybody said, we've agreed to abide by the Shanghai communique, and that was 40 years ago, and everything just gone fine since then, right? That if there's ever going to be a deal out of these Israel-Palestinian talks, it's going to be based on constructive ambiguity on certain key questions, like Palestinian right of return, like recognition of Israel as a Jewish state or recognition of Israel. The two sides are going to say different things. And they're going to look at Turkey and Cyprus as a classic example where guarantees break down and what happened, you know. People are going to say things, they're going to look to guarantor powers to make that worth something. That exactly throws us back into this case because the US, Russia, UK are guarantor powers of the Ukraine's agreement in 1994 to give up its nukes for its sovereignty. But the problem is, and I don't want to make any excuses for Putin. I think what he did is a threat to the world peace, a threat to the world order, and not very nice to the people of Ukraine. Nevertheless, that regime that signed that treaty ceased to exist. It doesn't exist. All right? There is a regime not elected by anybody, with no particular legitimacy, not universally recognized, not yet had an election, not accepted by the whole of the country. Think analogy, the same kind of regime that China had from 1949 until the US deigned to recognize it in 1979. So that a change of regime like that, you know, it shuffles the deck. It doesn't make issues go away, it shuffles the deck. And in fact, people were playing fast and loose. That there was an agreement, you may recall, in the third week of February between the EU, the US, and the Soviet Union about holding new elections in Ukraine in May. And that was torn up 2 days later, presumably by the people of Ukraine, but with the encouragement of the US and the EU. So everybody's playing it a little bit loose and seeing what they can get away with here, and it's gone too far. Probably the US and the EU went too far with encouraging a complete change of regime and a sensitive geopolitical space that's between the two powers that should have been negotiated at every step. And they're paying the consequences for it. And Putin is exploiting the situation that they did that to claim a legitimacy that he doesn't have, but only needs at the moment to prove it to his own people, to step into there and defend those interests. So, great question. Another question? Yes?
I have a question. Do you think Germany itself is powerful enough to counterbalance Russia to prevent Russia from letting the Crimea independent or join Russia? Or if indeed that happened, I mean, if Crimea can become independent, do you think there will be real harms to American interests or EU interests?
I think that the German-Russian relationship is the most important relationship in Europe. Mm-hmm. I think it's the most important relationship to Germany, and I think it's the most important relationship to Russia. Russia has anxieties about China from time to time, and then it doesn't, then it makes up. And right now it's in a warm phase of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but it worries about that Siberian-Mongolian frontier, all right? Russia has no interest in Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua anymore, not this Russia, right? This Russia, the interest of this regime in Russia is getting the Russian people to accept a different kind of regime in Europe than the one the countries of the EU have. one which is maybe not delivering as much economically, which is certainly not granting as much in the way of personal liberties, but in which it wants to tell them, we're Russian, we know the Russian character, we stand up for Russia, we're patriotic, whatever. Germany is the key to enabling that or not enabling that through economic power, as a matter of fact. It's not going to get fought out, should not get fought out on any battlefield. The levers for moving Putin are the levers of what economic outcomes are offered him. That he needs a mix of some kind of prestige outcomes in domestic politics without bad economic outcomes, which would undermine the consolidation those prestige outcomes would give him in Russian politics. Germany is the key to that, all right? Energy is the key to all of it, all right? That Europe is energy poor, that Russia is the great energy exporter, that the Baltics are particularly vulnerable, that the discovery of liquefiable natural gas reserves in the United States is a wild card that changes everything, that the infrastructure of LNG ports do not now exist in the Baltic countries, but if they were created over the next 3 or 4 years, they would greatly reduce the economic dependency of those countries on Russia. So that much as some of us debated 20 years ago whether NATO expansion was really the best thing to do for the countries of Eastern Europe, even though they loudly demanded it, some of us, myself included, argued that no, soft landing, a genuine, harmonious relationship with Russia was more important, that a hostile, aggrieved Russia is more dangerous to you than non-membership in NATO given a benign Russia, okay? Similar today, which is that the real, Russia needed to respond. Putin felt he needed politically to respond to what the changes in Ukraine. Ukraine is deeply felt in Russian politics, all right? It has been for a long time, and it's historically part of that space. He's not, although I don't blame the Poles, the Estonians, the Latvians, the Lithuanians for 1 minute of saying, if he could do it there and gets away with it, he can do it here. And there are Russian-speaking minorities, particularly in the Baltic countries, that they worry about. The real, if he wanted to do that, it's hard to imagine what NATO would do to stop it other than unleash a thermonuclear exchange that would make the prize not worth having, right? Real security for those countries, energy independence would be a bigger step toward real security than the NATO guarantees are in the real world. To get energy independence requires time to build that infrastructure, and a period in which the building of that infrastructure is not playable by Putin as a hostile act that he has to use force and blackmail to prevent, as he used force and blackmail to try and prevent Ukraine from joining the EU treaties. It's a very delicate game of chess here. And one additional reason Germany is the key player here is not just that Germany and Russia have always been the arbiters of that part of Europe, and it's always been important to them, but German populations, through the horrors of defeats in 2 world wars, are more conditioned to the subtleties of how this game needs to be played. They don't need the red meat that some parts of the American public seems to need right now. Yeah.
We talked a little bit about this interaction between great powers, but what do you foresee for the internal situation in Ukraine? I mean, is there going to be a split? What can you say about that?
Well, it's a very good question, isn't it? You know, I mean, it's as the whole thing happened, those of us who are old enough to have been through it before say, well, didn't we have the Orange Revolution 10 years ago, and didn't it not work out? And didn't the Democrats in power turn out to be corrupt and feuding and fighting with each other? You know, you have to go really back in history. You have to go back to the Kievan Rus to find an independent Ukrainian regime. You had a Nazi puppet regime, you had a Soviet Socialist Republic, a post-Soviet republic, and there was something flawed about the sovereignty and the legitimacy of all of those iterations after Ivan the Terrible, frankly. Which doesn't mean that Ukrainians don't have the same rights as anyone else in the world to have their own country, their own polity, their own sovereignty and everything else. But you don't get that by deserving it, you get that by constructing it. And that from the breakup of the Soviet Union, in which the Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus were the three key players, right? The leaders of those countries were the three key players. Forward, there's been not any complete national reconstruction. I talked about the Stalin-Hitler Pact mainly for Russia's sense of its external borders. But the post-war settlement, not anything decided at Yalta, but the results of Yalta, the post-war settlement moved borders and populations in that part of the world. You know, Poland has been nicely described in a recent article, and I think it was in the New York Review of Books, as a part of Germany populated by Poles. In other words, the land, Poland, the eastern part of Poland was taken by Russia, by the Soviet Union, not Russia anymore, by Belarus now, and that in compensation, Poland was given what it didn't ask for, which was the eastern part of the old Germany, from which the Germans fled because they knew what their fate would be there, and from which the Poles displaced further west go there. And you have lines between Orthodox and Catholic, between autocephalic and metropolitan churches, all kinds of lines here, and they're very messy. And they're like the way Stalin scrambled the Caucasus deliberately to make it inconceivable that these could be independent countries by making them non-viable and moving around populations and grievances and putting them together in bad ways. That's the legacy. That's the terrible legacy, you know. But if you step back historically, look, Napoleon scrambled Europe, and we're still trying to sort it out. German and Italian unification, the way they happened, are the result of what Napoleon had done to the old order and what the Congress of Vienna tried to construct in the way of buffer states. And they're not neat. I mean, look around you in Italy. I don't want to trace every current problem of Italy to the manner of its unification, but it wasn't a pleasant one. And the relationship between the North and the South, in particular, is skewed by that. So that all of us live. China doesn't live. Japan doesn't live because they have more homogeneous, unscrambled populations. Korea doesn't live. But we in North America and Europe live in very scrambled history and ethnic and racial kind of situations, which take a long time to sort themselves out, and are not sorting themselves out and can't sort them out to any identikit template, something they come up with and say, to be a nation you have to have these 5 criteria. If you have it, fine, everything fine. No. Every nation finds its own way to nationhood, and it takes a long time, and they find it through trial and error, and bad errors lead to wars. And that's what we're seeing, all right? So nobody wants a war here, and posturing and abstractions will get us on a path to war, and posturing before your own domestic opinion shuts off reasonable lines of retreat, whoever is doing it. And if the U.S. is acting in a way that the U.S. government is posturing before its own domestic opinion to head off charges, encouraging Putin to posture in response to that for his domestic opinion, then we're blocking exit ramps, we're not opening exit ramps. Right? You know, conflict resolution is a tricky thing. It's not a science. Not all conflicts are going to be resolved, but most conflicts could be resolved, and it's in the interest of most parties to the conflict that they be resolved rather than go into worst-case spasms of violence, because any form of violence is a roll of the dice with unknown outcome and is thereby frightening to governments and powers in charge. They really don't like it. They like to play with fire. They don't like to get burned with fire. They like to walk that delicate line. And they all have this sort of common interest in staying on the right side of that line and preserving order. But in the mass democratic world that we live in, that we and our parents and grandparents have fought so hard to bring about, and that is united by the internet, people don't go in a back room and work it out. It's worked out in public, and it's worked out before democratic electorates that have been told for generations that the measure of strength is the big stick and standing up tall and projecting power. And it takes courageous leaders, and sometimes courageous leaders that don't do their own political futures much good. It takes Jimmy Carter, it takes the first George Bush to say, no, the best thing is to stop short of that. The best thing is to work this out peacefully. And people say, you're no good, we want someone better and stronger. But that's what we do here in the university, which is that we look at those case studies, we try and learn from them. We try and learn after they've gotten away so that we can at least draw lessons that we apply to the next one. Yes.
Are you saying from the U.S. perspective, the reason you think it's a very big thing is that this is the kind of scenario where the United States makes a big mistake? Or do you think that there are big U.S. interests that we also need to figure out in this particular situation?
Both, but I was actually thinking of the second more.
Okay.
I think that, so what are those interests?
Yeah, what is the
What are
gain
those interests?
to you?
This gets very tricky. If you were in my class tomorrow, we'd actually be talking about this. We'd be talking about energy policy. We'd be talking about an unstated but not unrecorded assumption of U.S. policymakers. It's in the archives. It's just not talked about much. That the feeling that the Second World War in particular, among its many triggers, one of them was the insecurity about oil, competition for oil resources, particularly Japan, Indonesia, particularly in that dimension, but also in Europe. And the feeling in a particular generation of U.S. geopoliticians in the 1940s and early 50s, that if we really don't want to have to come over there a third time with nukes on our back, that we have to construct a world order that takes away that competition for oil, just as Germany is to be rearmed, but the big weapons are to be kept under U.S. control. We don't want armed independent powers in Europe anymore. Right? We want NATO instead, alternative, right? We don't want competition for oil. The way to not have a competition for oil is to guarantee access to oil. Remember, the United States was self-sufficient in oil until the late 60s. That the oil issue for the United States, and it was certainly talked about a lot, was really about the oil needs of other places, securing Japan and Europe's access to cheap Middle Eastern oil. There's competition in there, particularly from the Italian side, Libyan oil, but basically about that the U.S. view of the post-war settlement, which the U.S. is still very attached to and afraid to let go of, is one where global oil supplies are secured. Therefore, when the Soviet Union broke up, really in the Clinton years, what might have been a rational policy about the post-Soviet republics turned into a pipeline politics and a pipeline competition. Right? It's really a very interesting field of study. I can only dip into it now. But an oil pipeline or a gas pipeline is an enormous sunk capital expenditure which will take 20 or 25 years of use to pay off. And when Strobe Talbot was arm wrestling as to whether it would go down from Azerbaijan to Turkey to the sea or whether it would cross Soviet or Iranian territory, all right? In other words, arguing that the economically efficient, geographically rational route should be diverted for geopolitical reasons to reduce the energy leverage of Russia and the energy independence of Iran told me that the U.S. still was and still is playing the geopolitics of energy supplies. The U.S. is very uneasy about Europe's dependence on Russian energy, piped for the most part through Ukraine, and very eager to find ways it can parlay its new natural gas bonanza to play against that. I'm not against that. I think that would be nice. I'm much happier. There are environmental arguments about LNG terminals in the U.S. There are domestic economic arguments being made now in the U.S. Senate about that fifth terminal. But there's nothing in a world order sense or in a peace sense wrong. And that the dependence on Russian supplies of energy-poor Europe is the unnatural destabilizing situation. A remedy to that is a stabilizing situation. But a remedy to that which shifts dependence on Moscow to dependence on Washington is obviously seen as a hostile act by Moscow. Something which has more European character, which is put together at the European level, might be more civil.
Just wanted to point out on this thing. My understanding of the energy dynamics in that part is the US LNG, even if it comes into Europe, it's not going to provide the volume to compete against Russian gas. That's the point. The only competing sources that Europe has, which could compete with the Russians, are the Turkmenian gas and the Iranian gas. Iran geopolitics is completely screwing it, and you're not being able to utilize Iranian supply. Turkmenistan has alternate routes through the Caspian Sea, which is not being exploited. Plus, the Azerbaijan-Turkish relationship is not letting it exploit pipeline through Azerbaijan into Turkey and into Eastern Europe. So, in that context, I mean, I just wanted to. It's not a question. It's just a note that North American gas. And the first instance of North American gas flowing as LNG is 2016, not before that. It's not going to play any part in the foreseeable future.
Well, I see it as something more interactive.
Yeah.
All right. In the 1970s, every point increment in GDP was taking 2 points increment in energy usage.
Yeah.
That was turned around. All right. So that it's the issue of the Keystone Pipeline in a way. You know, that you don't want to put yourself in an acute situation of energy dependence, but an energy glut is a disincentive and turns all the market signals the wrong way for energy efficiency. Right? Britain has shut down all of its coal mines since the miners' strike. Well, it's got plenty of coal. That's energy too. It's dirty energy. It's energy too. But if we're talking about the ability to be self-sufficient in energy, it's very interactive about how you want to do it. Yeah, I mean, it's the U.S. to take a parallel issue. In the Clinton years, the U.S. solved a geopolitical problem in the Middle East by a policy called dual containment of Iraq and Iran. Well, there's a limit to the number of major oil suppliers in the world that you can shut down without feeling it at the other end and still being the guarantor of Europe's oil or keep Europe from running around you, as the French wanted to do, and around your boycotts. So too often, the policy decisions are not informed enough by the SAIS graduates, and the interplay of energy and geopolitics is not understood. They both need to be in the room. People who take my class know I'm on a hobby horse against excessive secrecy, where the expert bureaucracy is shut out of decisions for reasons of making smooth decisions and keeping them secret. And you've got 3 or 4 people in the room, one of whom might not understand currencies, another of whom might not understand energies, another might not understand what a MIRVed missile is. Nevertheless, they're making the key decisions. Not good process. We'll understand the costs of slow, cumbersome processes and activating the bureaucracy, but the education we're getting and hopefully giving here should teach us all about the need to bring all these things, all these factors together and consult on those factors. To at least, if you're one day one of the 5 people in the room, to look around the room and know what expertise is missing and where to find it on the outside.
What about the cheeky Kiev point of view?
Yes.
Why not a bit of appeasement? Faraway country about which we know nothing, and simply let Russia deal with problems in its own backyard.
Well, the question is whether the time for that has slipped away from us. You know, too many words have been spilt. Was Danzig more important than the Sudetenland, or was the upshot of the Sudetenland what forced the stand on Danzig? You know? But I don't think we are without exit ramps. I think we're at a fluid moment. I think we are perhaps in the 3rd or 4th week of July 1914, not yet in August 1st.
Can I come back here?
No, I'm actually playing devil's advocate here, because I can see some of the arguments. But surely it's not such a bad idea to acknowledge that great powers have acute security interests in their own backyard. I mean, the United States, for example, would never accept Russian involvement in the crisis of Mexico. I know that sounds ridiculous.
Cuba
Oh, Cuba.
didn't accept it. Yeah. No, absolutely. And you know, the point, I'm on that side of the argument.
Yeah, sure.
When we talk about Afghanistan,
Yeah.
to think that there can be a stable settlement in Afghanistan after U.S. withdrawal, that India, Iran, and Pakistan, and for that matter, Tajikistan, are not bought into, is madness, right? That, which is, you know, the U.S. was on the other side of that issue when it made the UN take back that invitation to Iran to the Syria talks in Geneva. If anybody is serious about the Israeli-Palestine issue, they're going to recognize that countries that host refugees and sit on the border can't be taken out of the equation, all right, and that have interests. So yes, it's so. But where does that go? I mean, the nice end of that is that every sovereignty, except of course the United States, every sovereignty in this world is conditional, including the UK. You know, it's conditional to something, right? I mean, you can't go off and do that. You know, that's fine because that's a standard that every country can live with, right? As long as it's really every country. Even the United States has to abide by the Convention on Torture or the Convention on Refugees and Non-Reform Laws. We have had a little problem with that for the last 10 or 12 years, but you know, we aspire toward it. And that's the reason we aspire toward it. It's the reason why we aspire the 5 have treaties, have nuclear weapons countries of the NPT live up to the preamble of move toward disarmament as part of the trade-off where countries agree not to acquire nuclear weapons technology. Right? So that's fine. The problem is, if we're going to say that in the near abroad, in the former Soviet space, countries which, through no fault of their own, were part of an empire that is overthrown, still only get conditional sovereignty. And if you're on the other side of that line, if you're Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, fine. That's really hard when you consider that half of the Ukraine is really in Poland. You know, I mean, that Ukrainians living in Poland, Poland's living in Germany, whatever, but it's really an accident. It's like East and West Germany at a certain point, you know. It's why should everything from Kiev west to the border, chicken or not, be in a different world with different sovereignties, with different possibilities than Poland? Well, in the end, the world is like that. There's the answer, but you go to Kiev and try and sell that. Yeah. But the world is like that. I agree with you.
Well, most Western countries have rejected the validity of a referendum in Crimea based on the fact that there are Russian troops there. But say this is a hypothetical, Russian troops withdraw and Crimeans still vote to be part of Russia. What are the options for the West? Do they have to recognize the self-determination of Crimea to be part of Russia, or do they have other options?
Well, a very salient question, isn't it? Which is to say, Scotland is having a referendum in a few weeks on whether it's staying within the United Kingdom. Catalonia wanted a referendum. Madrid said it couldn't have it. Quebec wanted a referendum. And Canada said the rest of Canada has to agree that you get a referendum. The question is, can you have a referendum in an area without the larger sovereignty having a say in it? And does the larger sovereignty still have a say in it when there's no legitimate power in the larger sovereignty, as there is in Ukraine right now? It's really dicey, you know, which is that the revolution, and that's what it was, that chased Yanukovych from power in Kiev just called off all pre-existing bets. And it just opened up a lot of questions for which there are no good answers. So This was a revolution that took place mostly, but not exclusively, in Western Ukraine. Does it apply to Eastern Ukraine? Does it apply to Crimea? Can the non-Russian speaking, Western-oriented Ukrainians decide the fate of the whole country without regard for the people in the Russian-speaking areas who have in fact not voted? In fact, they did vote, they all voted, they voted in Yanukovych. He's a legitimately elected leader. That's another piece of inconvenience here, you know. And what our studies, and we're studying something that's in progress, so our studies are incomplete and imprecise, but what our studies should produce in terms of lessons for future policymakers is a reminder that when you take that ultimate step, when you go from the February 18th outside powers agreement for a staged referendum in May, all right, which is Professor Gilbert's solution of interested parties with an interest being accommodated, to what happens a week later, to Yanukovych fleeing west, you go into a whole other legal regime in which things that you could insist on with some solidity and legitimacy and persuasive power are now a lot more tenuous. So that, you know, I mean, look, I'm from the 60s. Revolution makes my blood rise too. I mean, it's exciting, right, you know? But, I mean, we're looking at this in Caracas. We're looking at this in Istanbul. We're looking at this in a lot of places where we have legitimately elected governments. The people elected a government, and now the people are challenging that government. So which people win? Count. And if the people chase away the government that the people elected, does everything go on before in terms of legal guarantees? And if the people chase away the government in one city, does that apply to the whole country? If the revolutionary sans-culottes of Paris chased away the monarchy and the National Assembly in Paris, did that hold for the Vendée? Well, the people in the Vendée said no. All right? You know? So it's always a contested question. Did the revolt against King George apply to Canada? Well, I guess it didn't. So it's, you know, I mean, it's tricky. I mean, what it ultimately comes down to is we've got a complicated world, an ever more complicated world, because information moves more freely without centralized. It moves on a decentralized level. People can communicate more freely. Democracy, despite it all, is more widely at least paid lip service to than ever before. And it creates a world of uncertainty and volatility. And yet, politicians, democratic politicians included, are afraid to face their populations naked in that kind of world. They want the certainties of old verities and things as before. And it's a tension. It's the tension that, reviewing my class tomorrow, got Ronald Reagan elected in 1980 away from the Jimmy Carter who was preaching complexity and trying to deal with complexity. And it's not unique to that country in that moment of the U.S. in 1980. We see it all the time. And, you know, there's no right or wrong. There's just no right or wrong. I mean, you can say that democratic politics means the people decide, and Reagan was right then because he won the election. But there are other ways of looking at it too. You know, it's an experiment, and we're all implicated in it. But I would argue that our safety and our freedom and our tranquility and our prosperity all depend on how far we can enlarge the discourse of complexity and in the political discussion, and not get captivated by the simplifications that drive politicians to desperate military steps.
Just interested in what about following on, like this international law being something we aspire to, but not something we abide to. So my question is, do you think that actually international law for a country like the US or kind of strong Western powers is really just a kind of tool of convenience? So in this case, the referendum is going to be voting against Western interests, so we use international law as a kind of tool to criticize that move. And whereas if it was kind of voting in our favor, we might just kind of stay calm on the international law as a kind of take away. I don't know what you think.
International law had real problems with what George Bush did in Iraq, for example. You know? International law has real problems with what the U.S. did in regard to enhanced interrogation. International law has real problems with killing people with drones in countries you're not at war with. All right? International law is violated every day. And some violations are made an issue of, and some are not. All right? That I go back, I think that the embodiment of international law today, the greatest single embodiment of international law today is the United Nations and the United Nations Charter and the various conventions and resolutions that flow from it. That was at least a second try, if the League of Nations was the first try. Perhaps there were tries in the 19th century that don't get called preliminaries for it, but look like preliminaries to me. All right. The problem, the huge difference, you had Franklin Roosevelt, the principal architect of the United Nations, but of course he had to sell it to Stalin and Churchill for it to be anything other than U.S. project. Right? And interestingly enough, the precursor to the end, they had the founding convention in San Francisco because the precursor to the NSA could then spy on every delegation and did. But that's a secondary point. What Roosevelt wanted to bring together the realism of power counts and countries with global force projection can ignore international law with the legitimacy of international law and the aspiration to not have another world war. His solution to that was very clear. It was called the Four Policemen, and one of them didn't count, Chiang Kai-shek. So it was really the UK, the US, and Russia would hold together the wartime Grand Alliance, despite everything he knew about what Stalin was doing in Eastern Europe, and he knew, there's no question that he knew about it, all right? He was trying to soft-soap the American people so that they wouldn't get upset about it, particularly Polish-American voters, but he knew. He said that the only answer to the international anarchy that twice produced world war is a concert of the real powers, is a grand alliance which hangs together only to the point of we don't want another world war. We're going to have our differences, we have our different economic systems, we have our different spheres of influence, whatever. In fact, Roosevelt's vision of it fairly explicitly foresaw spheres of influence, in which, I mean, one reason the Truman Doctrine came from the British withdrawal from Greece and Turkey is that was a lot of the British sphere of influence, okay? And Stalin and Churchill had divided the Balkans in the envelope agreement. So that was the kind of world. And we, all of us, live in the shadow of the breakdown of that. And, you know, you can take Harper's course, you can take my course, millions of books are written about why that broke down, whether Truman could have done anything about it, if it was all Stalin's fault, if it was all America's fault. All theories are entertained. And perhaps, you know, as Joe and I said about the Chinese Revolution, it's too soon, French Revolution, it's too soon to tell, you know, but we live in the shadow of that breakdown. So what we have, instead of having one overarching international concert of powers of the Four Policemen with three armies, you soon had competing alliances of NATO and the Warsaw Pact. You had two different models of collective security. Unipolar collective security, which is true collective security, which has its downside. You know, the powers that be stamp out change, stamp out national aspirations, preserve the status quo and everything else. But then you had two competing forms of collective security, hostile alliances, and you had the Cold War. And we're past that too. So do we then revert to the Four Policemen? Well, we did briefly. We did briefly with George H.W. Bush and the Kuwait War and cooperation with Gorbachev and Shevardnadze there. That was a path. Why did that not continue? Was that an unnatural moment in Russia's history because Gorbachev was trying to do something which was impossible, which was to save the system by reducing outside conflicts? Or was that something which, like Roosevelt's hope in '45, might have been built on and nurtured if we weren't so intent on NATO expansion to the border, ripping up the ABM treaty? You can honestly make both sets of arguments, and I cannot honestly tell you this one is right or that one. I can tell you which one I favor, you know. But I might favor a different one next week when I read something else or think something else or something else happens. But that is the upside and the downside of the international anarchy we're in, all right? I mean, in the strictest legal theory terms, there's international anarchy because there's no international sovereign. You only have law where there's a sovereign that can enforce the law. There's no agreed sovereign here. That the UN Charter provides for a military committee and a UN military force, it never happened. The Cold War happened instead. So it isn't there. So the UN goes begging for poor countries to send peacekeepers to countries where the superpowers don't particularly care about, right? And the UN winks at all kinds of the sexual violence and other things that goes on between the peacekeepers and those poor countries. A poor substitute for the plan, all right? Why does the International Criminal Court always only bring cases in Africa? Because African dictators have no protectors. Let me just retrospectively, when I was saying that in today's world order, there are two prominent countries that envision themselves righteously in larger frontiers than they now occupy, Russia and China. I would add France a little bit. I would. Or else, what are those troops in Mali and Central Africa about? You know? They're about France holding on to the notion that they can have a relationship with those countries like Putin had with Yanukovych, that they are protectorates responding to the sphere of France, and France will bail them out when they get in trouble. So I just did that to want to take some of the East-West communism, anti-communism thing about it. It's just the nature of countries' histories, where they are, how they came together, what their present borders are. Germany might have such attitude, being shorn of so much territory and influence the world, but it doesn't. Germany has come to terms with its two defeats, is very content with its borders, is very content with its role in the world, isn't content with the way we run our economy here, but that's a separate issue. But you've got those three powers. France, the faded power that won't come to terms with the fading of empire. China, the reviving power, who sees it naturally going somewhere it hasn't reached yet. And Russia somewhere in between. Russia is not fading like France. Russia is not destined to be the Russian Federation only. That's an artificial moment also. That's like France without Alsace-Lorraine between 1870 and 1914, an unstable moment. So, you know, there's no, it's rather than right and wrong, rather than left and right, rather than east and west, the current state of the international settlement and the international order has left several powers that envision their influence beyond their frontiers, and somebody is always might want to object to that, including the people of the countries beyond those frontiers, which in a sense the Ukrainians are doing in this case.
Do you want to give some just final closing remarks?
Closing remarks? Well, it isn't over.
Well, do you have any questions? I know a lot of people here have been engaged in some discussions, have either served in Ukraine, and so I think they have different opinions about things. So are there any kind of questions that you would like to pose?
Sure. Let's start with the ones I put out for the group.
They were.
I printed it
And
just
let's
in
start
case
with
you
the
ask.
title also. Does anybody see any exit ramps
You
also?
wanna, the 1 and 2?
Okay. Must acknowledgement of Russian power and interest mean setting aside international law? And I'll give you 2 also, which is what kind of precedents would that set? In other words, setting aside international law is set for other military powers with territorial and political claims beyond their present borders, for example, China. You've heard what I think about it on both of those points, but you've been thinking about it. Yeah.
I wasn't. The Chinese question. I have been following the South China and Japan thing for much closer than I would like to because of work and stuff. My basic thing is that, yeah, I mean, definitely the Chinese definitely are going to feel a little more empowered by the Russian move. But it also comes with some form of, you know, I don't know how to articulate, just coming to, I'm not Jewish, so I can't answer it properly. But there are a lot of, compared to Ukraine and Russia, where you have a failing EU with its own mess, trying to support Ukraine, and America, which is not very active in its support, in case of South China Sea, in case of Japan and China, you have a lot of conflicting interests, overlapping economic interests, which is not going to lead it into a full-scale conflict. I do not see it happening because in Southeast Asia, you have this huge Chinese diaspora. B, you have so much of trade relation, even though, let's say, Vietnam is so scared of China, even though, let's say, Malaysia may be scared of China, but Philippines especially. But you have this huge overlapping trade relationship which is not going to let anything happen. You have the sea lane, which is the Malacca Strait, which is of common interest to all these countries in letting it remain free. So it's like, as the BC Journal's title says, stalemate in very practical sense. Involvement which India is going to come in, if Japan ever gets into play, Japan expects India to step in, and Australia to a lesser extent, but I don't think it's going to happen because of energy relationship. India to step in as a part of the democracy diamond. That's what Abe said in 2008, if I'm not wrong.
Very helpful of him.
Yeah. And the third point was, well, energy is always an issue, but China has other sources now. The gas market is going to expand. It's not as critical for them to exploit the South China Sea for energy, pure energy gain as people might be thinking. No, because the Australian gas is going to flow in, the African gas is going to flow in, the North American gas is going to flow in. It's not going to be as competitive in terms of the energy domain. It's more so in terms of, who's got the bigger hand in the game kind of a play. But there is a lot of overlapping interest to make it escalate any further in case of China.
I think it would be good to keep this focused by going directly to the China Islands issue, which is what we talked with this group in the fall. And I think it is the parallel. Apart from what Putin might do next if he gets away with this, I think that's the implication that we want to think of. What you say is all very relevant to a question that neither you or I know the answer with. We've often heard argued before that economic intertwining makes war impossible and that war is broken out anyway. Maybe not between two countries that have a McDonald's, but countries that have trade anyway. I think that there are many players in that China equation. And in fact, Japan also has an expansionary mentality under the present government, which is to say, we were once there, we lost the war, we're here, but we really belong there. We need to push back, we need to reassert. Not any feeling in Japan that we want to use force to do that again. They know where that goes. But some feeling in Japan that if they play their cards right, the US will provide that force, or India will provide that force. And I was just reading on the train coming up here, Daniel Markey's Council on Foreign Relations book about no exit from Pakistan. And he goes into, well, the US real interest is finding a way of containing China's expansion. India is the key, even if India is a bad actor. Kind of dangerous, India is sort of expansive too. And for that matter, maybe South Korea is a little expansive in terms of the rest of the Korean peninsula. So that's an extremely dangerous situation, which was extremely dangerous and had no rules before anything happened in Ukraine, and continues to be extremely dangerous and have no rules, whatever happens in Ukraine. The lesson I draw from it finally is that every situation is somewhat different. Everybody knows the last TV news program they watched. It's on their mind, but then they come to the next situation. I think that, some people claim that Obama backing off from his red line in Syria encouraged Putin to do what he did in Ukraine. I don't buy it. I think the interests that were engendered there, I think the expectations of how the U.S. would react in the two countries were different. I think the Russian interests in the two countries were different. Maybe at some kind of level, it's always at some kind of level. Khrushchev, after the Bay of Pigs and the Vienna summit, said that Kennedy's a little wet behind the ears. Maybe I'll push a little in Berlin. Misjudgments like that are made, but only so far. So where does it get us? On China, I have, of course, not spoken to the current Chinese leadership, but I've spoken to many people who have spoken to top Chinese leaders over the years. And the consistent impression that I've been getting since at least the late 1980s is that for certain issues, for example, Taiwan. All those economic arguments are interesting and real, but we put them aside when it comes to an issue like that. All right? And there's a tremendous danger of the West, which is so premised on economic argument and economic rationality, not understanding that for China, certain issues doesn't matter, that's economically irrational. This is a core nationhood issue. Why would John Kennedy blow up the world over Soviet missiles in Cuba when there are already Soviet missiles blowing in the United States? Same kind of thing. Why would China do that? Because China would do that. Because the US would do that. Because of reasons that it's hard for an outsider to understand, that it's politically fatal at home not to do it, and it's politically thought legitimate to do it. Right? Those are the dangerous situations. I don't think Putin is in that situation with regard to Ukraine or Crimea. I don't think Russian opinion feels he's got to do something. I think he was improvising. Everything I read is that his own security advisors were blindsided, that he did this with a small group after feeling he had been dissed by reaching that February agreement and having it been ignored. And Sochi was now over. And he did it, so here we are. You're normally such talkative people, huh?
Maybe not after midterm.
All right, please join
And
me
before spring break.
Yeah.
in thanking Professor Unger for giving this insight. There's still some wine, so you guys want to chit chat and talk about what's been happening. And make sure to come to the next workshop.